37 AD, a cold, starving Europe. Plague is spreading. Kingdoms crumble, empires rise, and the fate of nations hangs by a thread. One king dares to challenge the might of France and ignites a war that will last a century. This is the story of the 14th century, where fire, steel, and ambition forged the modern world. In 1337 AD, King Edward III of England made a bold claim to the French throne, citing his descent from Philip IV of France, his grandfather. The French court naturally rejected his claim, but Edward was determined. What he could not gain by law, he resolved to seize through war and conquest. Thus began the 100 Years' War, one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in European history. A war that would shape the destiny of England, France, and the entire continent. This pivotal moment also marks the starting point of Paradox Interactive's grand strategy game, Europa Universalis 5, giving players the chance to step into the shoes of rulers during a turbulent age of political intrigue, dynastic disputes, and military revolution. The 14th century was a period of extreme turbulence, where natural disasters, social upheaval, and political conflict converged to create a crucible of change. Across Europe, famine, plague, and war ravaged populations, while simultaneously paving the way for the rise of centralized monarchies, modern nation-states, and new economic systems. This century witnessed the decline of medieval feudalism, the emergence of professional armies, and the early stirrings of the Renaissance that would later transform culture and society. In this exploration, we will focus primarily on Europe, charting its chaotic journey from the end of the medieval period to the dawn of the early modern age. Along the way, we will examine the major powers: England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, Iberia, Northern and Eastern Europe, and the Balkans, and see how each navigated the perils of the 1300s, framing the 14th century, catastrophe and transformation at the dawn of the 14th century. Europe had enjoyed 3 centuries of population growth, agricultural expansion, and relative prosperity. Yet these gains were abruptly halted by the Little Ice Age, a period of climatic cooling that brought shorter growing seasons, harsh winters, and widespread crop failures. In 1315, a cold and wet spring triggered the Great Famine, which would last until 1317. Entire harvests were lost, food prices skyrocketed, and hundreds of thousands perished. In some regions, desperate populations even resorted to cannibalism. This catastrophic famine weakened the resilience of European society, making it more vulnerable to the calamities that would follow. Only a few decades later, a far greater disaster struck, the Black Death. Originating in China in the 1330s, the bubonic plague spread along trade routes via infected fleas and rats aboard merchant ships and caravans. By 1348, the plague had reached Italy, and within 2 years it had spread across France, England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond, killing between 1/4 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Entire towns were decimated, villages abandoned, and agricultural production collapsed, resulting in social, economic, and political upheaval on an unprecedented scale. The combination of war, famine, and disease made the 14th century one of the most violent and transformative periods in European history. On the battlefield, the 100 Years' War pitted England against France, but Europe was far from the only theater of conflict. In the East, the once mighty Byzantine Empire was being squeezed by rising powers. Serbia, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Turks steadily eroded imperial territory. Meanwhile, Mongol successor states, including the Golden Horde, faced pressure from emerging powers like Muscovy, Lithuania, and the Ming dynasty, signaling the end of Mongol dominance from Ukraine to China. Yet amid this chaos, seeds of innovation, social mobility, and political reform began to take root. The medieval feudal system, once unassailable, started to erode under the pressure of technological change and population loss. Peasant soldiers, armed with longbows at battles like Crécy 1346, demonstrated that disciplined infantry could defeat heavily armored knights, signaling a shift in military strategy. The introduction of gunpowder artillery further diminished the dominance of traditional feudal lords and fortified castles, while simultaneously strengthening the power of monarchs who could finance and organize new armies. The Black Death also altered the social structure of Europe. With millions dead, surviving peasants gained leverage to demand higher wages, leave the land, or challenge feudal obligations. Wealthy landowners were often forced to sell or lease their estates to emerging urban merchants, accelerating the transition from a feudal agrarian economy to a market-driven commercial system. Cities and trade hubs, particularly in Italy, became centers of wealth and culture, connecting Europe to the Middle East, North Africa, and China via the Silk Road and maritime trade networks, England and France. The seeds of conflict by the early 14th century. England had been transformed by the reign of Edward I, who subdued Wales, established dominance over Scotland, and strengthened royal authority. His son, Edward II, proved weak, losing Scotland to Robert the Bruce and presiding over the catastrophic Great Famine, earning the scorn of his nobles. Ultimately, Edward II was overthrown by a conspiracy led by Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, paving the way for Edward III to ascend the throne at the age of 14. Edward III was ambitious and militarily gifted. He quickly consolidated power, subdued rebellious barons, and set his sights on France. However, the 100 Years' War did not begin as a straightforward invasion. The Plantagenets, the English royal family, traced their roots to Normandy and Anjou in France. English kings held substantial territories in France as vassals to the French crown, and the courts of England had used French as their primary language since the Norman conquest of 1066. Edward III's claim to the French throne was therefore a dynastic dispute, rooted in feudal law and centuries of cross-channel inheritance. Over time, though, this dynastic feud transformed into a national war, with profound consequences for both England and France, reshaping their economies, armies, and political structures. Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of states, Central Europe, dominated by the Holy Roman Empire, was a tangle of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, and principalities. Although often criticized as being neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire, the medieval empire traced its legitimacy to Charlemagne. Crowned by the Pope in 800 AD, by the 14th century, the emperor's authority was mostly symbolic, constrained by the need to negotiate with powerful princes, bishops, and electors. The election system ensured the empire remained politically fragmented, preventing the centralization seen in England or France. During the 100 Years' War, this fragmentation was starkly visible. Emperor Louis IV of Bavaria allied with England, while King John of Bohemia, his nominal vassal, fought for France at Crécy, dying heroically on the battlefield. Italy, merchant republics, and early Renaissance. Meanwhile, Italy emerged as a hub of commerce, art, and culture. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa became maritime powers, controlling trade with the Middle East and beyond. The wealth generated by merchants allowed for the financing of navies, fortifications, and artistic endeavors, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance. Northern Italy was formerly part of the Holy Roman Empire, but in practice, its city-states operated independently, forging alliances, waging wars, and building dynasties of merchant princes. In Rome, the Papal States maintained nominal sovereignty, but the Pope had fled to Avignon, creating a schism that weakened the Catholic Church's political influence. Keywords. Naturally included in this expansion, 14th century Europe. Edward III, 100 Years' War. Black Death, Great Famine, Little Ice Age, Medieval Europe. England, France, Holy Roman Empire, Italy, Iberian Peninsula, Reconquista, Ottoman Turks, Byzantine Empire, Mongol Empire, Golden Horde, Muscovy, Lithuania, Renaissance, medieval, feudalism, knights, longbow, gunpowder castles, mercantile economy, Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, trade routes, Silk Road, Constantinople, Crusades, Papal States, Avignon Papacy, political centralization, nation-state, European warfare, medieval plague, serfdom, urban merchants, dynastic disputes, Norman conquest, Plantagenets, Normandy, Anjou, Edward II, Robert the Bruce, Isabella of France, Roger Mortimer, Grissy, artillery, medieval military revolution, commercial networks, medieval famine, population decline, social upheaval, economic transformation, medieval kings, medieval nobility. By the early 14th century, England had experienced decades of political consolidation and military ambition under Edward I, known as Longshanks. Edward the Vine had successfully subdued Wales, incorporated it into the English crown, and extended his influence into Scotland, attempting to assert overlordship over the independent Scottish kingdoms. He also faced formidable challenges from rebellious barons at home, but managed to strengthen royal authority, setting the stage for a more centralized monarchy. However, his son Edward II proved far less capable. Edward II's reign was marked by military failures, political instability, and personal scandals. His loss of Scotland to King Robert the Bruce during the Scottish Wars of Independence weakened England's northern position, while his perceived favoritism toward court companions alienated the English nobility. The catastrophic Great Famine of 1315-1317, which killed hundreds of thousands, further eroded confidence in Edward II's rule. The Plantagenet claim to France, Edward III's ambitions were not merely domestic. His claim to the French throne was rooted in his lineage. He was the grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother, Isabella. While Philip VI of France rejected this claim, Edward III viewed it as both legitimate and a justification for war. It is essential to understand the feudal context of this claim. The Plantagenet dynasty was of French origin, tracing its roots to Normandy and Anjou. English kings had long held territories in France, including Aquitaine and Gascony, as vassals of the French crown. At one point, the English crown controlled more French lands than the French king himself, though always as feudal tenants. When Edward III initiated military campaigns in France in 1337, he technically acted as a disloyal vassal, seeking to reclaim and expand his ancestral lands. What began as a dynastic dispute between two noble houses gradually evolved into a national war, marking the birth of modern European nationhood. Over the course of the 100 Years' War, identities shifted, and English and French soldiers increasingly fought not as feudal levies, but as subjects of emerging, centralized monarchies. The 100 Years. War, key battles and transformations. The 100 Years' War was a series of conflicts, punctuated by intermittent truces and political maneuvering, rather than a continuous campaign. Yet it profoundly reshaped military strategy, society, and governance. One of the most notable early battles was Crécy, 1346, where Edward III's forces achieved a stunning victory against the numerically superior French army. Here, Welsh longbowmen decimated the ranks of French knights and nobles, demonstrating that well-trained infantry could outmatch the heavily armored cavalry that had dominated European warfare for centuries. This shift marked the beginning of the decline of feudal knightly power and the rise of professional armies. Later in the war, the introduction of gunpowder artillery transformed sieges and battlefield tactics. Cannons and early firearms rendered traditional castles and fortifications vulnerable, further diminishing the power of the medieval aristocracy and enhancing the authority of kings who could finance new forms of warfare. The social consequences of the war were equally profound. Repeated plagues, famines and conscription depopulated villages, weakened the feudal hierarchy and increased the bargaining power of surviving peasants. In England, the Black Death created labor shortages that allowed serfs to demand higher wages or move freely, gradually eroding the feudal obligations that had bound them for centuries. Meanwhile, in France, the monarchy faced internal challenges. Civil unrest and territorial fragmentation weakened royal authority, creating opportunities for ambitious nobles and foreign powers alike. The devastation of French lands, combined with economic disruption from the plague, further destabilized the feudal order. Yet over time, these hardships prompted centralization and the emergence of more cohesive national institutions, laying the groundwork for a modern French state. England and France, economic and cultural shifts. The 100 Years' War was not merely a military conflict. It was also a catalyst for economic and cultural change. In England, the loss of French territories curtailed reliance on continental trade, encouraging the growth of domestic industries such as wool, cloth, and metallurgy. English monarchs invested in taxation systems, administrative bureaucracies, and naval power, strengthening the foundation of the state. In France, repeated invasions and territorial loss forced monarchs to reform governance, strengthen royal finances, and centralize authority over previously independent vassals. Over time, these reforms allowed the French crown to assert control over regional nobility, integrate disparate provinces, and recover economically. Culturally, the 14th century saw the rise of chivalric literature, chronicles, and courtly traditions, which recorded the deeds of monarchs, nobles, and armies. Figures like Jean Froissart, the chronicler of the 100 Years' War, captured the heroism, tragedy, and brutality of the period, leaving a lasting record of medieval society in turmoil. At the heart of medieval Europe lay the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling and fragmented political entity that stretched across modern-day Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, northern Italy, and parts of Czechia, often ridiculed by later historians as neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire. The reality of the 14th century empire was far more complex. From a legal and religious perspective, the empire traced its legitimacy to Charlemagne, crowned emperor by the Pope in 800 AD, symbolically succeeding the authority of the ancient Roman Empire. To medieval jurists and theologians, the Holy Roman Emperor was the vicar of God on earth, holding nominal suzerainty over all of Christendom. Yet, in practice, the emperor's power was highly limited. The empire consisted of hundreds of kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, principalities, margraviates, and free cities, most of which were autonomous in all but name. Authority was highly decentralized, and the emperor often struggled to enforce his will over powerful regional rulers. The political system of the Holy Roman Empire was unique. The emperor was elected, not hereditary. A council of prince-electors, comprising powerful secular and ecclesiastical leaders, chose each new ruler. To secure election, candidates had to grant extensive privileges and concessions to these electors, effectively preventing political centralization. This decentralization became painfully evident during the 100 Years' War. While Emperor Louis IV of Bavaria sided with England, his own nominal vassal, King John of Bohemia, fought and died at the Battle of Crécy, 1346, for France. Such contradictions highlighted the fragmented nature of imperial politics, where loyalties were flexible and military alliances were often dictated by personal gain rather than national or dynastic loyalty. Economically and socially, the empire was a mosaic of wealth and poverty. Urban centers like Nuremberg, Cologne, and Augsburg thrived as hubs of trade, craftsmanship, and banking, while the countryside remained tied to medieval feudal systems, dependent on agriculture, serfdom, and local lords. The Black Death exacerbated social pressures, further destabilizing rural economies and challenging traditional hierarchies. Italy, merchant republics, and the dawn of the Renaissance. While the Holy Roman Empire struggled with decentralization, Italy emerged as a unique European powerhouse during the 14th century. The Italian peninsula was a patchwork of city-states, duchies, and maritime republics, enjoying significant autonomy due to the empire's limited authority in the region. Cities were often surrounded by walls and independently governed, giving rise to vibrant urban economies and politically savvy elites. Northern Italy, home to the wealthiest and most populous cities in Europe, became the incubator of the early Renaissance, producing artists, poets, and humanists such as Dante Alighieri, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. These figures bridged the medieval world and the emerging age of artistic and intellectual revival, laying the foundation for the Renaissance that would flourish in the 15th century. The maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa dominated trade across the Mediterranean. Venice, in particular, became the commercial hub of Christendom, linking Europe with the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and the Levantine markets. Through trade in spices, silk, and precious metals, these cities amassed extraordinary wealth, funding naval fleets, fortified cities, and cultural patronage. Genoa, rival to Venice, controlled key ports and sea lanes in the Western Mediterranean, often engaging in colonial ventures, trade wars, and alliances with foreign powers. Pisa, though smaller, remained a significant maritime force, maintaining trade connections and occasional military expeditions. In central Italy, Rome remained the spiritual capital as the seat of the Papal States, but political control was tenuous. In 1305, the Pope fled to Avignon, initiating the Avignon Papacy, during which French influence dominated ecclesiastical politics. This period sowed seeds of tension within the Church, culminating later in the Western Schism, when multiple claimants to the papacy divided Europe along political and religious lines. Further south, the Kingdom of Sicily, originally established by the Normans, remained a contested region, frequently governed by foreign dynasties and contested by Aragonese, Angevin, and local forces. Despite these challenges, Sicily's strategic location made it a center for Mediterranean trade, agriculture, and culture, linking Europe with North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. Italy's prosperity in the 14th century was built upon trade, banking, and commerce rather than feudal agriculture. Merchant families such as the Medici in Florence leveraged wealth to influence politics, finance armies, and patronize the arts, signaling the decline of purely land-based aristocratic power. Urban economies thrived on textiles, banking, shipbuilding, and international trade, integrating Italian cities into a global network spanning Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The wealth of Italian city-states allowed for investments in art, architecture, and public works, fostering the cultural flowering that defined the Renaissance. Politically, Italian city-states were highly competitive. Alliances shifted rapidly, with Venice, Florence, Milan, and Genoa constantly vying for supremacy. Warfare between city-states often involved professional mercenary armies, reflecting the broader European trend away from feudal levies toward organized paid forces. These developments mirrored changes seen in England. While the 100 Years' War consumed England and France, the Iberian Peninsula experienced its own epochal transformation. For centuries, Islamic Moors had ruled large portions of the peninsula. Ever since the initial Umayyad conquest of Hispania in 711 AD, the Christian kingdoms, beginning with the Kingdom of Asturias, had resisted Islamic expansion and gradually reclaimed territory through intermittent campaigns over the centuries. By the 14th century, the Reconquista had entered its final stages. The Christian kingdoms had consolidated into three major powers: Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. The Kingdom of Portugal fortified its borders, maintaining independence and expanding maritime trade along the Atlantic coast. Meanwhile, Castile and Aragon emerged as dominant powers, securing political and military supremacy on the peninsula. On 30th October 1340, the combined armies of Castile and Portugal decisively defeated an invading force led by the Marinid Sultan of Morocco, marking the last significant attempt by Muslim forces to reconquer Iberia. Meanwhile, Aragon, a maritime power, developed one of the era's most formidable navies, second only to the Italian republics of Venice and Genoa, extending its influence to Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily. These developments set the stage for the rise of the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the 15th and 16th centuries, enabling global exploration, colonization, and trade that would reshape world history. Northern and Eastern Europe, Vikings, Crusaders, and emerging states far to the north. The descendants of Viking warriors had long since abandoned their pagan ways, but retained their military culture. By the 14th century, the Kingdom of Sweden had conquered much of Finland, while Denmark extended influence into northern Estonia. These territories became battlegrounds for expansion and colonization, often led by military orders such as the Livonian Order and the Teutonic Knights, who pursued Christianization campaigns against remaining pagan populations. In Eastern Europe, the Golden Horde, a successor state to the Mongol Empire, still exercised control over the Rus principalities, including the future territories of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The Mongols, recently converted to Islam, generally allowed their Eastern Orthodox Christian subjects a degree of autonomy as long as tribute payments were maintained. Among these principalities, the Principality of Moscow was beginning its rise, laying the foundations for the future Tsardom of Russia. Further east, the Kingdom of Poland had recovered from devastating Mongol invasions in the 13th century. Remarkably, Poland remained relatively unscathed during the Black Death, likely due in part to its thriving Jewish communities, whose religious customs and practices may have mitigated the spread of disease. By the late 14th century, Poland had entered into a matrimonial union with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, setting the stage for the powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which would dominate Eastern European politics and culture in the early modern period. The Lithuanian Grand Duchy, newly Christianized, resisted Catholic crusading orders and expanded into former Mongol territories, consolidating power and influence in Eastern Europe. Together with Poland, Lithuania formed a formidable political and military entity, shaping the region for centuries to come. The Balkans, decline of Byzantium, and the rise of the Ottomans. The Balkans were a cauldron of cultural and political tension in the 14th century. Historically, a melting pot of Greeks, Slavs, Albanians, Bulgarians, and Turks, the region had been dominated by the Byzantine Empire, the direct continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire. Its capital, Constantinople, had remained the largest city in Europe, a center of Greco-Roman splendor and Orthodox Christianity. Yet Byzantium's decline had been long in the making. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, a fleet of Venetian and Catholic crusaders diverted their mission to conquer Constantinople, pillaging the city and establishing Latin control. The Byzantines eventually regained their capital in 1261, but the damage to infrastructure, wealth, and political stability was permanent. By the 14th century, the Byzantine Empire faced pressure on all fronts. The southern Slavs were gradually pushing into imperial territories, while the kingdoms of Bulgaria and Serbia rose to prominence under strong leaders such as Dušan the Mighty, consolidating the Balkans into powerful regional states. The greatest existential threat, however, came from the Turkic peoples advancing from Anatolia. After the Battle of Manzikert, 1071, and the fragmentation caused by the Fourth Crusade, Turkish principalities, particularly the Ottoman Beylik, began steadily encroaching on Byzantine lands. By the late 14th century, the Ottomans had captured key cities in Bulgaria and Serbia, gradually surrounding Constantinople. While Edward III of England and Philip VI of France were locked in conflict in the West, The Byzantine Empire faced annihilation in the east, a fate that would be realized with the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Economically, the Byzantines had become increasingly dependent on the Italian maritime republics such as Venice and Genoa. These cities supplied essential goods, financed military campaigns and controlled trade routes, reducing the once great Eastern Roman capital to an economic satellite of Western Europe. Despite this, Constantinople remained a vital crossroads of trade, culture and religion, bridging Europe and Asia. As Europa Universalis V begins in 1337, players step into a world on the edge of transformation, a world where kingdoms crumble, empires fade and new nations rise from the ashes, from famine to fire. From plague to progress, the 14th century stands as one of the most defining chapters in human history, the bridge between the medieval and modern ages.